Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight, we bring you a brand new Hercule Poirot case, The Mourning Locket, a Hercule Poirot Mystery. A tale of family secrets, hidden wills, and a murder shrouded in grief, where Poirot must once again call upon his little gray cells to unravel the truth buried deep within a single locket of mourning. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching this mystery from. Drop it in the comments below. And if you enjoy our stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. Now, let's dive in. Chapter 1. The Funeral at Greystone Hall. The skies above Hampshire were heavy and colorless that September morning, a thick veil of gray that seemed to press low upon the fields and woods surrounding Greystone Hall. The ancient oaks that lined the drive stood motionless in the still air, their branches arching solemnly over the procession of black-clad mourners making their way toward the family chapel. It was a building of stone darkened by centuries of English rain, its walls tangled with ivy, its tall windows half-shadowed by stained glass that caught what little light there was and scattered it dimly over the interior pews. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and incense, mingling with the faint must of damp stone. The scene, though dignified, was weighted with a certain oppressive silence, as if the house itself mourned its master. At the head of the family pew sat Lady Margaret Greystone, her tall figure cloaked in black silk, her face concealed by a veil that softened nothing of her proud and imperious bearing. To her right was Edward, her son, pale and restless, his long fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against the edge of the bench. He was a young man of barely 30, with sharp features and an anxious air that betrayed the strain beneath his outward composure. Clara, his younger sister, sat beside him. Her face was tear-streaked, her eyes swollen, her slender hands clasped tightly as though she feared they might betray her trembling. The grief that hung about her was genuine, though there was something in the way her eyes flickered to the door, as if she longed to escape the suffocating atmosphere. Behind them sat Richard Greystone, the late Sir Alistair's cousin, a man of stout build and ruddy complexion, his watch chain glinting against the somber black of his coat. Richard leaned toward the family solicitor, Mr. Phelps, whispering with poorly concealed eagerness even as the vicar intoned the solemn words of the burial rite. To those who glanced his way, Richard's expression seemed less sorrowful than calculating, as though his thoughts were already upon inheritances, properties, and the division of the estate. In the far corner of the chapel, half obscured by the shadow of a stone pillar, sat Emily Trent, the young ward of the family, her fair face pale and her hands folded in her lap. Her presence was expected. She had lived under Sir Alistair's roof since childhood, yet there was an uncertainty about her, a sense that her grief belonged not wholly to this family, but to some private loss of her own. The vicar's voice echoed through the chapel with measured cadence, each phrase of scripture rising and falling in the heavy air. The words of eternal rest and resurrection seemed to linger, mingling with the faint rustle of fabric, the muffled coughs of servants at the back, and the restless tapping of Edward's fingers. At last, the service ended, and the mourners filed slowly from the chapel into the graveyard beyond, where the coffin of Sir Alistair was lowered into its final resting place. The earth was dark and damp. The ropes creaked softly as the casket descended, and a light drizzle began to fall, as though the heavens wept with the family. It was Lady Margaret who stepped forward with trembling hands. From her reticule, she produced a small, oval locket of gold, its delicate clasp worn with age, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. She pressed it to her lips before holding it above the open coffin. "It was his last gift to me," she whispered, though her words carried clearly to those standing near. "A portrait of us both, painted when we were young, and a lock of his hair. It shall rest with him always." Her voice faltered for the first time, and then she lowered the locket gently onto her husband's breast. A murmur of sympathy stirred among the mourners. To those who watched, it was a tender gesture, a token of love, bound with memory, that would lie with him for eternity. But eternity was to be short-lived. By the following morning, A cry echoed through the halls of Greystone Hall. Edward burst into the drawing room, his hair disheveled, his face pale, his voice sharp with horror. "Mother," he exclaimed, "the locket, it is not there. The gravekeeper swears he saw no one tamper with the coffin, and yet it is gone." At once the room erupted in whispers and alarm. Lady Margaret rose to her feet, her face draining of color as her hand clutched at her chest. Clara gasped and covered her face with trembling fingers. Richard muttered darkly about thieves and robbers, his tone tinged with something like satisfaction at the scandal. Even the servants at the edges of the room whispered to one another, their eyes wide. To disturb the sanctity of the dead, it was an outrage, an abomination, and yet the locket, so intimate and so precious, had vanished as if the earth itself had swallowed it. It was in this moment of confusion and fear that a new presence entered the drawing room. Small in stature, neat in every detail of dress, his dark suit immaculately pressed, his shoes gleaming, his mustaches waxed to perfection. Hercule Poirot, though his frame seemed almost swallowed by the grandeur of the Greystone drawing room. His presence filled the space, commanding silence as he inclined his head with the gravest courtesy. His eyes, bright and keen, moved swiftly from face to face, noting every flicker of expression, every nervous gesture, every glance that darted too quickly aside. "My deepest condolences, madam," he said softly to Lady Margaret, bowing with old-world grace. "But if I may, it is clear that a most curious theft has taken place. When one dares to disturb the tokens of the dead, it is rarely the dead who are the true object of such a crime. Non, it is the living who matter. The locket is not merely a trinket, it is a symbol, and to steal it is to send a message." He raised one finger delicately, as though conducting an unseen orchestra. "Messieurs et mesdames, permettez-moi tout assure you. Hercule Poirot will discover who has taken this token, and for what purpose. The truth, however deeply buried, will not remain hidden. For the little gray cells, they see what others do not." The family fell silent, unsettled by his certainty. Richard cleared his throat, Edward clenched his fists tighter, Clara turned her face away as though to hide some private emotion, and Lady Margaret, though stricken, inclined her head in firm agreement. Poirot's eyes lingered on each in turn, his mind already weaving threads of possibility, already sensing the patterns of deceit and grief that would soon entangle them all. And so, beneath the painted gaze of Greystone ancestors hanging from the walls, the first steps of the investigation began. A locket stolen from the grave, a family in turmoil, and Hercule Poirot, already alert, already thinking, already listening to the whispers that others could not hear. Chapter 2. Whispers Among the Heirs. The rain had ceased by the afternoon, but Greystone Hall remained steeped in a gloom that no clearing sky could dispel. The great house, with its long corridors and high-ceilinged chambers, seemed to brood in silence, as though the stone walls themselves withheld secrets. Poirot, ever the keen observer of detail, found the house most curious. The carpets muffled footsteps too well, the curtains were drawn too tight, and the faces of those who passed through its rooms were marked by unease. Here was not simply a family in mourning. Here was a family unsettled, each member withdrawing into their own thoughts, whispering in corners, avoiding the direct gaze of others. To Poirot, such behavior was most revealing. It was Lady Margaret whom he first sought, for the widow's grief was genuine, and yet beneath her sorrow lay a strength of will that could not be ignored. She received him in the morning room, a chamber of faded tapestries and a great window that overlooked the damp gardens. Her veil had been lifted, revealing eyes sharp with exhaustion, but not without fire. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, her voice low, "the theft of that locket is more than a crime. It is a desecration. My husband rests in his grave without the token I promised him. To think of it in another's hands, it is intolerable." She pressed a lace handkerchief to her lips, then added bitterly, "I cannot believe any in this house would stoop so low. And yet, who else could it be?" Poirot inclined his head with courtesy, his hands folded neatly before him. "Madam, We must not rush to judgment. The theft, it is bold, yes, but also personal. It is an act that required knowledge of the locket's existence and of its placement in the coffin. That limits our possibilities, does it not? Already the circle of suspicion grows smaller. At this, Lady Margaret's gaze flickered toward the door, as though she dared not name aloud the thoughts that had crossed her mind. From the widow, Poirot turned his attention to Edward, the heir to Greystone. He found the young man in the library, pacing before the tall shelves of books, his movements restless, his words tumbling forth with nervous urgency. "I swear to you, Monsieur Poirot, I had nothing to do with it," Edward exclaimed before the detective had asked a single question. "I love my father, despite our disagreements. Yes, I know I was not always the son he wished me to be. He thought me weak, indulgent. But to steal from his grave? Never." His face flushed as he spoke, his eyes darting toward the decanter of brandy on the side table. Poirot noted the agitation, the excessive denial before accusation, the quick hand that poured a glass and drained it too fast. "You are troubled, mon ami," Poirot said gently. "Your grief, it sits heavily upon you. Yet grief does not make a man so restless, so eager to defend himself before he is accused. No, there is something else, is there not? A pressure upon you, perhaps financial." Edward's face paled. He muttered something about debts, about the burden of estate management, about how the family fortune was not as sound as it appeared. But he quickly turned away, refusing to meet Poirot's gaze. To Poirot's little gray cells, this was most interesting indeed. Clara, by contrast, was all fragility. Poirot found her seated in the conservatory, the glass panes fogged by the damp air outside, the scent of earth and flowers heavy in the air. She sat with hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed upon the ground. "The locket," she whispered when Poirot asked. "It was Mother's treasure. Father gave it to her when they were young, before the quarrels, before the disappointments. To take it from her now is cruel beyond measure." Her voice trembled, and tears slipped down her cheeks. But Poirot noted that even in her sorrow, her eyes flickered nervously when he asked whether she had seen anyone lingering near the chapel. I thought I saw someone by the yew trees. After the service," she admitted at last. "But I cannot be sure. The mist, the shadows, it might have been Cousin Richard. Or perhaps only one of the gardeners." She buried her face in her hands. "I should not have said anything. Perhaps it was no one at all." Yet Poirot filed this detail carefully away. The nervousness of Clara was not the nervousness of guilt, but of someone afraid of speaking truths that might unravel the fragile peace of her household. Cousin Richard was another matter. Poirot found him in the billiard room, a cigar smoldering in the ashtray beside him, his stout figure hunched over the green table as he struck balls with unnecessary force. "A scandal, that's what it is," Richard declared with a bitter laugh when Poirot raised the matter of the locket. "Imagine, thieves creeping about the family grave, stealing baubles from coffins. Mark my words, Poirot, it's outsiders. Vagabonds. Perhaps one of those laborers who hangs about the village tavern." Poirot listened, his head tilted slightly. "And yet, monsieur," he said smoothly, "the thief, he must have known the locket was placed in the coffin, must he not? That is not knowledge one finds in the tavern." Richard's ruddy face darkened, his cigar snapping between his fingers. "What are you implying? That one of us did it? That I, perhaps, had something to gain? Rubbish. I've lived in Sir Alistair's shadow long enough. If I wanted the man's trinkets, I should have taken them while he lived." His words, though blustering, were too sharp, too defensive. Poirot smiled faintly to himself. "Ah, but you see, monsieur, you make a point most curious. When one waits until death, it is no longer theft but inheritance." Richard glared but said no more. Last, Poirot sought Emily Trent, the ward, whom he found in the music room seated before the piano, her fingers touching the keys without pressing them, as though she feared the sound of music in a house so steeped in grief. She was pale, her eyes shadowed with sleeplessness, and when she looked up at Poirot, her expression was that of one who carried a secret too heavy for her slight frame. "I have nothing to tell you, Monsieur Poirot," she said softly. "I was at the service, I returned to my room. I slept. I know nothing of the locket. Yet Poirot noted the tremor in her hands, the way her voice faltered when he mentioned Lady Margaret's devotion to the keepsake. There was something unspoken here, some tension between ward and mistress, between gratitude and resentment. Poirot, with his keen sensitivity to the human heart, felt it immediately. When evening fell, Poirot returned to his chambers within the guest wing of Greystone Hall. He arranged his belongings with meticulous order, shoes polished, ties laid out neatly, hairbrushes aligned with precision. For to set his surroundings in order was to prepare his mind for clarity. Seated by the fire, he reflected upon the whispers he had heard that day. Lady Margaret's fury, Edward's agitation, Clara's fear, Richard's bluster, Emily's evasions. Each was a piece of the puzzle, a thread that would, in time, weave together into the pattern of truth. Already, Poirot sensed that the locket itself was not the heart of the mystery, but a key to some hidden tension within the Greystone family, some secret buried not in the coffin, but in the hearts of the living. He leaned back, fingertips pressed together, mustaches twitching in thought. The thief has made a bold gesture, he murmured to himself. But such boldness, it is never random. It is personal. Ah, my little gray cells, you have much work to do. And as the great house of Greystone creaked in the night, Poirot knew that whispers alone would not suffice. Soon, secrets would be forced into the light. Chapter 3. The House of Secrets. Greystone Hall by daylight was an edifice of grandeur, its stone walls standing proud against the rolling countryside, its windows gazing out like the watchful eyes of a sentinel. Yet by nightfall, the house seemed to shrink inward, its shadows lengthening, its silence oppressive. Poirot, who was accustomed to the charm of well-ordered drawing rooms and the sparkle of conversation, found himself walking corridors heavy with gloom, the portraits of stern ancestors glaring down upon him with eyes that seemed to follow his steps. It was not merely a house of wealth and lineage. It was a place steeped in unspoken history, a place where secrets clung as tightly as the ivy to its walls. The morning after his initial interviews, Poirot requested a quiet tour of the estate. It was ostensibly to admire its architecture, but in truth he wished to see the arrangement of rooms, the passageways, the places where a figure might slip unseen. Lady Margaret obliged, though with a touch of weariness. She accompanied him through the long gallery, where the polished floor reflected tall windows, and in the family chapel once more, where the stone altar stood cold and unyielding. Poirot lingered by the pews, his gaze lingering on the faint smudge upon the floor near the coffin's side. It might have been the mark of a shoe, recently wiped, or perhaps only the shadow of damp stone. Yet Poirot, ever attentive, knelt and examined it with a careful eye. "A print, madam," he murmured, "not made by the heavy boots of the gravediggers. This was finer, more delicate, a lady's shoe, perhaps." Lady Margaret's face stiffened. Impossible. No woman of this house would dare approach the coffin unbidden. Poirot only smiled faintly, rising with a little bow, leaving the remark to hang like incense in the cold air. As they moved through the rooms, Poirot asked seemingly idle questions. Where did each member of the household sit at meals? Which servants had been with the family longest? Which doors were rarely locked? Lady Margaret answered with the poise of a hostess, but now and then a note of strain entered her voice, betraying that she understood the direction of his inquiries. In the library, Poirot paused before the great desk where Sir Alistair had once conducted his affairs. The surface was immaculate, but a faint outline suggested that a small box had once rested there, recently removed. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And here, madam, there's something once? A casket, perhaps." Lady Margaret hesitated, then replied, "A jewel box. It contained little of value, mere trinkets. It has been locked away in my chamber since his death." Poirot bowed once more, though in his mind the observation took firm root. When death comes to a man of wealth, it is not only grief that is stirred, but temptation. Later that day, Poirot requested to speak with the servants. He had long known that staff, if loyal, were the unseen chroniclers of a household, observing what their masters believed unseen. Mrs. Penfold, the housekeeper, was a severe woman with lips pursed so tightly they seemed reluctant to part. She informed Poirot with pride that no servant of Greystone would ever stoop to theft. Yet when pressed, she admitted in hushed tones that quarrels had grown more frequent among the family. Since Sir Alistair's health declined, there has been tension, she whispered. Miss Clara weeps at night. Master Edward storms through the halls. Lady Margaret grows distant. And Miss Trent. Here she broke off abruptly, shaking her head. Poirot leaned forward, his voice soft and coaxing. And Miss Trent, madam? You may speak freely. Mrs. Penfold glanced toward the door, then muttered, She is not happy here. She fears her place is uncertain now. Sir Alistair promised her protection. Without him, who is to say? The housekeeper's eyes flashed with sympathy before she excused herself briskly, leaving Poirot with a morsel of truth wrapped in silence. It was in the late afternoon, as Poirot strolled alone in the long gallery, that he overheard the first true whisper of conspiracy. The voices of Edward and Richard drifted through the half-open door of the smoking room, their tones low, urgent. Poirot paused, his head inclined ever so slightly. If it comes out, we're ruined, Edward hissed. You should never have mentioned it at all. Richard's gruff reply followed. Better it comes from us than from her. She knows too much already. Poirot did not intrude, but quietly retreated, his mind alight with speculation. Her, they had said, was it Clara, delicate and fearful? Emily Trent, evasive and pale? Or Lady Margaret herself, unbending yet haunted? The pronoun was small, but the implication vast. At dinner that evening, Poirot observed the household with his customary attentiveness. The meal was served in solemn quiet, broken only by the clink of silver and the occasional cough. Clara barely touched her food, her eyes rimmed with red. Edward drank deeply, his hand trembling as he refilled his glass. Richard ate heartily, but avoided his cousin's gaze. Emily Trent excused herself early, complaining of a headache, while Lady Margaret remained stern and composed, though her hand lingered protectively upon the brooch at her collar, as though it, too, were a relic to be guarded against invisible thieves. Poirot dined sparingly, but feasted upon their faces, their gestures, the subtle language of discomfort that no words could disguise. When at last he retired to his chamber, Poirot took up a small notebook and began to sketch the outlines of the mystery as he saw them. He wrote one word at the top, motive. Beneath it, he listed the heirs, Edward, debts and desperation. Clara, sorrow and secrets. Richard, resentment and bluster. Emily, fear and dependence. Lady Margaret, grief and pride. Each, in their way, had something to conceal, something to protect, something to gain. The theft of the locket, though bold, was no random act of greed. It was symbolic. Poirot could feel in his very bones. The locket was chosen not for its value, but for what it represented. A token of love, yes, but also of promises made long ago. Promises perhaps broken. He closed his notebook with a snap, then rose to gaze from his window into the night. The moon hung pale above the gardens, casting yew trees into long, twisting shadows. Somewhere in the house, a door closed softly, followed by the faintest echo of footsteps upon stone. Poirot smiled to himself, mustaches quivering. The house, it breathes secrets, he whispered, and soon it shall exhale them. The locket has been opened, yet its secrets remain shrouded in shadow. The air is heavy with unanswered questions, and danger lingers just beyond the candlelight. Poirot has glimpsed the outline of a truth too dreadful to ignore, but for now, the puzzle remains unfinished. Part 2 of the Mourning Locket, a Hercule Poirot Mystery, is on its way. Hold your breath, keep your wits about you, and be ready, because when the next chapter arrives, every secret will demand its reckoning. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. Until then, take care and goodbye for now.